Last year, I went on an A5-day, 60+ mile backpacking trip alone. It was something that I knew I was capable of. I had a lot of friends that had also done so. It was really a unique experience to be completely and totally alone for so long. Often, the nearest person is literally miles away from you. Sleeping wasn't all that wonderful for me though. My tent was warm and comfortable, but I was very on edge. Just something about being alone in the woods at night. Every night. I would stay up as late as I could and fall asleep out of exhaustion. My trip ended. Everything went perfectly. I had a wonderful experience. I had brought a Kodak disposable camera with this trip on me, and I wanted to get my pictures developed as soon as possible. I was eager to show my friends and family all of the gorgeous wildlife and views that I had seen. After a couple of days, I got a call from Costco saying that my pictures were developed and that I could come and get them. Now, I really didn't have the patience to wait to see all of the pictures, so I opened the package as soon as I got into my car. They'd all come out wonderfully, and then I got to the last set of pictures. There were 10 pictures I don't remember taking. The pictures were of me, sleeping, in my tent. Two years ago, my wife and I decided we would sleep in a shelter on the AT after a long 40-mile hike. We were having dinner with another couple who was also camping down the trail a bit after sundown, when suddenly a man comes into the shelter. He turned down joining us for dinner and instead sat on the edge of the shelter, simply watching us. Nightfall came quickly and it was now time for bed. My wife and I were the only other people in the shelter that night, and we tried to make some small talk before going to bed. The man finally communicated with us a little as he set up the last of his gear and crawled into his own bed, turning off the light. At around 11:30, the man opens up his backpack and proceeds to pull out some kind of device and open and close it for 30 minutes. Problem is, the noise was the distinct noise of a pocket knife. Around 12, the man goes out with just his lamp to use the quote bathroom. At this point, I tried to place my wife's hand on the knife beside a pillow because I know she will be awake and terrified as well. The man quickly then returns to the shelter and just stands by his sleeping bag for the next 20 minutes while we lay there perfectly still with my back facing him. Then out of nowhere, I begin to hear him coming towards us. I panicked and let go of my wife's hand as I was holding it, and I suddenly turned onwards to where he was facing. I honestly thought that I was about to have to fight for my life. The man scurried back to his 15 feet away bag and zipped it up quickly. I'm still not sure what his intents were to this day, and it still bothers me the most. I stayed awake for the rest of the night and would occasionally make noises to make him realise I was still awake. I'm an avid backpacker, and 2 weeks ago, I took my boyfriend on his very first trip. We did a short one-night out and back in Colorado's Front Range. He's asthmatic, so I decided to keep it short. The trail we took started from Echo Lake, which, for those unfamiliar with, receives a couple of hundred visitors every weekend. That's actually quite busy by backpacking standards. The particular trail that we're on, Chicago Lakes Trail, is actually quite popular by day 2, but we decided to make it an overnighter. After about 2 or so hours of hiking, we eventually reached the last Chicago Lake. As we arrived there, we're met by about 8 other people who are also camping at the lake. We spoke to them for a little bit before eventually continuing our way to Upper Chicago Lake. The upper lake itself is about half a mile past and 300 feet higher than the lower lake, with lovely views overlooking the lower lake itself. Upon arriving, we're the only ones there, along with 30-something men, and despite the exposure to high winds, we decided this would be a good place to set up our camp. We actually had quite a late start to the day, so by the time the camp was all set up, it was about 6 PM and the sun had settled behind the mountains. The last of the day hikers had since left and we're the only tent set up at the lake. It was getting pretty windy and chilly, so we decided to retire into our tent for the night. We ate dinner overlooking the lower lake from our tent and then zipped ourselves up. Now you've got to note that with the rainfly covering my tent, there's no way to see out of it. Now we stayed up for a bit longer before dozing off. Now at some point later, who knows how much later, I was awoken by what I thought was very heavy winds. After listening for a bit, I decided something alive was out there. It sounded like a squirrel, maybe even a bear. I really didn't know, it was just scaring me, so I woke up my boyfriend because I was scared. After listening for a bit, he agreed that the rustling was definitely not the wind. We then kept as quiet as possible, hoping not to spook it, just in case it did turn out to be a larger animal. We then both took out our knives, ready for whatever this was. And then, he saw it. It orientated towards the left side of the tent from where we were laying. He then put his hand over my mouth so that way I would be quiet. He pointed to it. There was a shadow of a human being cast upon our tent. It was a full moon, so we could practically see like it was daylight outside. It was so bright that you could walk around without any headlamp, no problem. I think this is what allowed the shadow to be created. So we're quiet as possible, desperately trying not to alert whoever the hell was outside our tent that we were awake. We had our knives pointed in the direction of them. We stayed like this for what felt like an eternity, staring at the shadow as the wind came in from bursts from the tent. Finally, he or she then moved, and a hand touched the tent. No, I mean, a hand grazed our tent. The person reached their hand out and put enough pressure on the tent to point the rainfly depression towards where we were. You could see the outline of a hand. After about 10 seconds, the hand disappeared. The shadow retreated when it heard some rustling, and suddenly, not a thing for the whole rest of the night. It's needless to say that we didn't get a wink of sleep that night. At around 7 AM, we emerged from the tent. Now there was zero signs of other campers, but there was one thing. About 2 feet away from our tent was a lighter. It wasn't mine, it wasn't my boyfriend's, and we're pretty sure that neither of us had seen that thing before. We then quickly made our way back down the rest of the trail to return home. Now upon returning, we didn't see one sign of any other person staying there, and that means whoever it was may have even been living off the land. It didn't make sense how they could have got that far away from us that quickly without leaving a trace. This occurred when I was 18 and backpacking my way through the world. I always looked a few years younger than I actually was. Often I had problems getting into places. I often found myself hissing, "No really, I am an adult," and people refused to believe me without ID. So I arrived in Western Australia in January, in a little known town that looked nothing like the brightly coloured postcards that I had seen of Sydney. I had rented a car and was getting used to the Aussie way of driving, and I didn't pay attention to the fact that I was running out of fuel. So naturally, the car suddenly gave up with a whimper and came to a halt. I wasn't worried, since I had the spare tank in the truck as advised to for travelling long distances in Australia. I had problems getting the lid off though. No matter how hard I pulled it, it didn't give in. So I started to walk back to the little cluster of shops that I had spotted earlier. I was greeted by a man on an ATV thing, sitting just outside of a shop. He nodded in the direction of my road and said, "Problem with your car, missy?" Now I must have looked puzzled because he smiled and said, "No one comes walking in here from that way. There's nothing there." I explained my situation and he listened emphatically. Did you rent the car from Creepy Freddy? No wonder it gave up on you. You can't trust that bloke, you have to see what I'm saying. He then introduced himself as Charlie and quickly got the lid off the spare tank for me. Wanna ride back to the car? It's absolutely boiling out here. I couldn't just leave you like this. I felt stupid hesitating. He seemed like such a nice guy. He was right. The sun was terrible. My shoulders had already become burnt in the sun. He must have sensed my hesitation because he suddenly put a hand on my shoulder and smiled. I'm not the boogeyman. I promise you. I just don't want anybody walking in this weather. Come on, I would have offered you a ride anyway, even if you're a 40-year-old bloke too. Here, take this helmet. The head isn't even worth protecting anyway. And I got back onto his ATV. The spare petrol tank just in front of me, feeling somewhat uneasy. Just tap my shoulder if you want me to slow down, alright? He drove the short distance to my car but didn't slow down. I tapped his shoulder. I tapped it again. He drove straight past it. In my rearview mirror, I could see the grin on his face as he sped up. I couldn't jump. It was too high and it surely would have killed me. There wasn't much I could have done. I don't know what his intentions were, but he wasn't talking to me. I felt that his intentions were evil. This continued for at least 30 more terrifying minutes until I could see a little rest stop, clearly made for people to stop and enjoy the view. As we approached a rest stop, I saw my chance and grabbed hold of his throat with both hands, squeezing as hard as I could. I could tell that he was really struggling for air as he was trying to keep the vehicle on the road as we come up to the rest stop. I had no choice to do this. I then threw myself off, tossing the helmet and screaming loudly, just trying to wake the dead. There was a truck there, but nobody in sight. However, only a moment later, the door to the loo opened and a terrifying looking man with a beard suddenly jumped out and demanded to know what the hell was happening. I pointed to my abductor and cried that he tried to kidnap me. The grisly man tried to grab hold of the abductor but wasn't quick enough. Soon, he was gone. The grisly man turned out to be really nice and phoned the police for me and waited until they got there. Since that day, I no longer judge people by the appearance. Charlie was a nice looking bloke, charming smile, and seemed to have good intentions. The grisly man, George, looked like he had just been coming out of an ancient lair and was ready to kill somebody. But really, he was just a gold-hearted guy. Back when I was 17 and on exchange, my friends and I decided to take a circuit trip to see more of China. We lived in the north, Harbin, so the first step was to take a train down to Beijing and meet up with some other exchange kids. Since we're underage and there are very strict rules about travel, we told our host families that we were visiting our friends in a town just a few hours even further north called Jiangsu. Some of us got dropped off at the train station about 15 minutes before the train to Jiangsu, planning to wait there for a few hours before the Beijing train boards. In the end, we got cocky and ended up running towards the train at just about 10 minutes before it was scheduled to leave. Because it's China, where timeliness can go a bit too far, the train had already gone. The gate manager laughed at us because we looked young, and the guy comes over to us and asked us to see our tickets. We hand them over and he takes off running. We give chase to this guy to the last of the gate manager and others in the area, but we couldn't catch the guy, he was too quick. So there we were sitting in the train station. We can't go home because it's not like we can say, oh, we missed a train to Jiangsu hours ago, just got back now. We can't afford to buy new tickets, so we just stalked the station for the guy. We just sat ourselves down and mopped. All of a sudden, there's this weird older lady that leans over and whispers, "You wanna go Beijing? I can get you there for half the price of that train." Yeah, for us once, right? So we politely declined her, saying that we're not interested. She aggressively grabs my arm and starts pulling me up, saying that she's gonna take us to Beijing. My friend then attempts to wrestle me back off of her, and is now way beyond suspicious. He asked her to come with him as he goes from stranger to stranger, telling our situation and asking if this woman sounded trustworthy. Some said yes and some said no. Well, good enough for us. We follow her out to the station to an alley behind it. We stop outside a convenience store. There were 3 big guys who asked us to take our bags. We felt very uncomfortable and tried to resist, but they suddenly snatched them and we're trying to take them back. We're trying to ask the lady what's going on, but she keeps telling us that they work for her, it's fine. So we sit there for 45 minutes and she gives us a lollipop. At that point, we really start to get scared. So what are you gonna do? We sat down sucking on our candy, trying to figure out what was happening, and there's just silence. 45 minutes pass. There's more people milling around us now. Shady lot by the look of most of them, and most of them don't speak Mandarin or English. My friend who gets scared really easily just begins crying. She really doesn't know what to do, and the lady just keeps on shoving convenience store snacks at us and will not let us leave until we eat them. We then started to joke amongst ourselves about how nice it was that they's given us candy. Then suddenly, out of nowhere, this bus appears. There's not even any seats inside it. There's just beds stacked in 3s. One of the men opened the bottom hatch and they throw our bags in there. We're told to take off our shoes, given slippers and a blanket. Turns out, this was a commuter bus. Actually, a lot of what I imagined the night bus in Harry Potter was like. Over the trip, we ended up having a ball with the other passengers, one of which was very drunk and from far, far away. This could have ended a lot worse than it actually did. And the fact that it was a real bus still amazes me to this day. At the end of the day though, we got scammed really badly. Okay, so some quick background. I'm an American living abroad in a place with lots of nature and mountains not far from my house. It's been a great past month's weather, so I've been taking advantage of it by hiking nearly every day. Now the country I'm in is incredibly low key, especially in the residential towns, so safety always remains. Now the mountains are just less than a mile from our house. On this day, I was chatting with a friend in the US and decided to go up to the mountain's base and loop back down. It's about 3 miles but not as strenuous as hiking. So I'm talking with her and making my way up this sloped paved road to get to the base and have a first unsettling encounter with a truck driver who tries to salute me. I just give him this look back like, what the hell, I'm alone, you're a fool, making me feel unsafe. This doesn't turn into anything, but I'm on guard. I'm by myself after all, because my husband is away at work. I go to the base and I'm telling my friend about this creepy truck driver, and suddenly, I have this urge to get out of sight. I'm at the mountain's base, which is to the left, and in front and to the right of me is an 1/8 of a mile parking lot. The mountain also has skiing in the winter. I get across the parking lot to the right and enter the forest across from the mountain. Now at the time I'm really thirsty, and the stream water at the edge of the forest is drinkable, so I start taking sips with my palms. Now this area of the forest is right by the parking lot, with a walking trail to get back down from the mountain's base, but it's still enclosed by lots of trees and shrubs. So anyway, I'm stood over there taking a break and drinking some water, still talking to my friend, when a different man enters the forest where I am. He's staring at me. Seriously, he gave himself away from the moment he entered the forest. It's just something about the way he was, to do with his body language. Now he's strong, in shape, has a white tee, blue shorts, brown hair, and eyes with light skin. He's just staring at me, but he doesn't approach me. Instead, he walks adjacent to me, crossing the path over the stream and goes to the other side of the stream directly across from me. I don't hear what my friend is saying, I'm watching him. I notice then that this guy has a knife. Like clear as day, this guy has a knife. He leans up against a tree, gripping the knife, and just stares at me, waiting to see what I'm gonna do. I then decide that going deeper into the trail is a no-go. It seems he's anticipating that I'm distracting talking from my friend and that I'm going to continue on my way. This isn't an option because the trail doesn't lead onto a road that cars can drive on for a good while. There's much fewer people on this trail too. I've seen enough horror movies. I suddenly realised that my uneasiness and need to get out of sight when I get to the mountain might have been just because I was also being pursued by the knife man, not just some random sleep-deprived truck driver looking for a good time. I turn on my heel and sprint out of the forest. Luckily, I see a car driving towards where I am. It's a mother teaching her daughter how to drive. By this point, it had started to pour down randomly, and I look like I'm a lunatic myself running towards them. I'm only 5'7" and blonde, not with a creepy huge knife, so hopefully they should stop. They do. I explain to them what has happened and they let me into the car immediately. I lock the door and then they call the police. Then about 30 seconds later, I see the knife man walking towards the direction of where I came from, the mountain's base. He's walking briskly and doesn't have a car of his own. The car I'm in has tinted windows, so I knew that he didn't know I was in there. I then tell the mother that that's the guy, but we don't want to provoke him. He then quickly disappears before the police can arrive. I give the police a description, but now I don't even think they ever found him. Part of me wants to believe that nothing was ever going to happen, but the way he went about it made me realise that he was definitely up to something. Even the way he was flashing his knife at me, sizing me up, and it seemed like he knew what way I was going, and it seemed as if he knew I was foreign. I was on the phone and might not have noticed him, but I guess I looked like I was an easy target. My friends and I back in college weren't necessarily ghost hunters, but we liked to go out into the woods at night to find old abandoned houses, graveyards, and it seemed like they were plentiful when you go out into the middle of nowhere. A common place for us to go is a park which wasn't very far into the woods and had an old bridge that was supposedly haunted. As an explanation as to why the bridge was so scary, there is a light at the end of the bridge and the shadows from the trees form what looks to be figures. When you sit in the middle of the bridge, the wind makes the figures look like they're moving towards you. To the unsuspecting visitor, this can be frightening, so we like to take our friends there to go and freak them out. Now to set the scene, it was late summer on a Wednesday night, probably around 2 AM. We were all on a summer break and nothing was going on, so we decided to take a couple of guys down to the bridge to give them a good old scare. The area isn't that easy to get to. There's lots of steep hills and rocky roads, so it's very secluded. So as expected, there were no other cars on the road. So now we get down to the bridge like we had so many other times before. It was tough to see the light at the end, but there were definitely plenty of shadows to add to the scare factor. So as you're supposed to, we parked our car in the middle of the covered bridge and turned off our lights as well as the engine. Immediately, the people we brought with us started to see the shadow figure approaching the car. We obviously tried to play it like it was real and the fact that it was scaring us. Well, we continued to scare them, but there was something wrong this time. The figure seemed a lot more lifelike, not like a moving tree in the wind, and it didn't feel like an illusion at all. I looked over at my friends and could tell that they noticed something was different this time too. It was at this point that I noticed they were no longer looking at the same shadow figure at the end of the bridge. This one had actually moved directly in front of our car. I started to panic and turn on the headlights because it was becoming a bit too real. Once the lights come on, the figure disappeared not too shortly after, and it didn't stop inching towards our car. So there was a guy dressed in all black down to his feet staring down at the hood of the car. After the lights come on, he kept on inching towards us. A prank, I thought. Somebody has to be pranking us, I said to our friends. But who would want to mess with us? We opened our windows and yelled, "Hey, you got us, that's pretty good." Nobody reacted. Thinking he was just trying to stay in character, we laughed it off and backed out of the bridge and started heading up towards the hill. We were now actually getting pretty deep into the woods. Maybe a minute or two drive from the bridge, we decided to head up that way to gather our thoughts and sort of process everything that had just happened since the adrenaline was still running pretty high. We then made our way onto a parking lot, which is normally about 4:15 on a busy day. This is because it's a very popular hiking location and there's lots of hikers here, but at 2 AM on a Wednesday, this place is totally empty. Upon pulling in, the spot was full. I mean, every single spot there was taken, even the one we normally go to. Considering the park was closed at dusk, this was a very disturbing discovery. This really didn't make any sense unless every one of these was hiking. I don't know, maybe they went out on a big trip together. God knows. We parked in the middle of the lot trying to figure out what was going on. I grew up just minutes from this area and the amount of cars was probably the equivalent of the entire population of the nearest town. So we sat there in that lot for about 5 or 10 minutes just asking each other what we thought was going on. And then 2 German shepherds come running down from the hill. They stopped to take our briefly, then continued running off into the woods. Hikers, they must have lost their dogs. Haha, we just laughed to each other. The girl that we'd brought with us then had a look of horror on her face and told us that we needed to leave. Confused and still a bit concerned, I agreed and we quickly left the area. She then put everything together. She then told us that these weren't hikers at all. The cult activity in this area was very high, and German shepherds are commonly used as sacrifice animals. I don't know where she got this information, but all I know is that it's been 5 years since this happened, and I'm never going back to that bridge again.
I am a 33-year-old white female from Los Angeles. 3 years ago, my boyfriend and I, as planned for 5 years, turned 30, sold everything we owned, including my car, took his Trailblazer, and decided to just travel around the States and Canada. I guess you could call us backpackers, as we tend to chase good weather, find a state park and backcountry hike into the wilderness for days at a time. My brother likes to joke that we are anti-establishment hippies. We don't necessarily live off the grid, but between the two of us, we have one prepaid phone we use for emergencies or checking in with the family and friends, one MacBook which I use for work. I'm a freelance writer and content creator. I mostly write boring white papers or web content. The whole point of our living situation is to live debt-free and have as few bills as possible. I only use free Wi-Fi, so 1 or 2 times a week we have to go to a city with a Starbucks. This background info is important so you know more about who we are and how simply we live. Neither of us are involved in social media, and know very little of Reddit or Instagram or use any apps, because our phone isn't a smartphone, so we don't even text. Last summer we decided to do some backcountry hiking in Arkansas. It's one of those states you don't ever really hear about other hikers visiting, but we read it has some beautiful natural landscape, and it does. The rules at this particular park were pretty lax. We didn't need a permit, and there were a few basic laws and guidelines, but there was no check-in needed. We had all the basics and had planned to do a 6-day hike, 3 in, 3 out. The whole time we were there, we didn't see or hear another soul. But one day, we were preparing to move off trail and find a camping spot as it was getting near dusk. Half a mile off the trail is usually the standard for us. We took what looked like a kind of animal trail, and about half a mile out we saw a green 2-person tent. It was almost camouflaged in the foliage, so we came on it almost by accident. Some backpackers prefer privacy, others are more social. We were the more social type. We had some great experiences camping near other backpackers, sharing stories, food, and a joint or two. We were around 30 yards away from the tent. It was zipped closed, so my boyfriend shouted out agreeing to make our presence known. No movement and no sound. We assumed the green tent guy either wasn't around or didn't want to be bothered, so we started off in a new direction to get some distance between us. We camped, never heard a peep. We moved along the next morning, completely forgetting about the green tent guy, until nearing the end of day 5 on our trek back. We were again looking for a spot to camp off the trail, when we came on a green tent again. This isn't that unusual, but normally backcountry hikers keep moving, so we weren't really expecting it. The tent flap was open, so my boyfriend yells, greeting again, and nothing. My boyfriend wants to go checking it out, saying it's weird and maybe someone's hurt. I didn't like the idea from the get-go, because even though we hadn't had any bad experiences personally, we'd heard enough stories from other backpackers about hermits and mountain men that want privacy, carry guns, etc. But my boyfriend assured me that everything would be fine, and if all else fails, offer him some weed and keep the peace, and we'd go on our way. As soon as we get within 20 yards of the place, the smell of decomposition is intense. My boyfriend has been hailing his greeting over the last 20 yards, and once the smell hits him, he stops and turns to me and says, "What if we find a dead body?" My skin crawled. I was immediately afraid. I've never seen a dead body before, and I didn't want to. The closer we got to that tent, the worse the smell got. I knew for sure we were going to walk in and see some old camper's rotting corpse. What we found was worse than that. Outside the tent was a dead doe's legs, all 4 of them, covered in flies. It looked like the legs had been cut most of the way, and then ripped off the rest of the way. It was a mess. Inside the body was the head of a deer, but the middle portion was swaddled in a blue fleece blanket that was blood-soaked at the bottom, where the legs used to be. It was laying on its side, bottom facing the tent entry. The tail had been cut off, and the anus and vagina was covered in dry blood and a gape, like something had been penetrating it. The same with its mouth. The bottom portion bent down at a scary broken looking angle. The tent was open, so we could see everything without having to go inside. Not that we would have anyway, but at this point the smell was almost debilitating. There was a dirty, almost empty clear bottle of Genghis baby oil and a stained green and white fringed kitchen towel. That was it. I immediately started crying and begged him to go. All he could muster was, "What the fuck?" And we turned and ran. We ran to the trail and jogged down it as far as we could go until dusk was fully on us, and we had to set up camp. We didn't go very far off the trail, and neither of us slept. We didn't start a fire or use headlamps after full dark. We just sat up, whispering to each other, going over and over what we had just seen. Every single noise startled us. It was like our brains were on red alert. I kept thinking that at any moment a dead deer rapist would come back to his tent, see our footprints or something, know we were there, and track us back to our tent. I've never been so scared in my entire life. Just before dawn, we tore down and started out. My boyfriend stopped at the ranger station on our way out of the park to report what we had seen. The ranger was a young guy, around our age, and looked as freaked out as we are by our story as we were telling it. He wrote most of it down, and my boyfriend showed him on a map approximately where it had been. He asked if I knew how the deer was killed, and at that point we hadn't even thought about it. We just assumed it had been shot. But because of the blanket